5 Live. Let's move on. The UK's immigration system is in intensive care, according to an influential group of MPs. Keith Vaz, who chairs the Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, believes plans to tighten security by checking people leaving the country are behind schedule. This is on top of new figures which show that as many as 3,000 illegal immigrants are being stopped each month. Most are trying to get from Calais to Dover. The government says it's building an immigration system which is tough but fair, and that it's making significant investment in improving security. Our political correspondent is Chris Mason. Explain this to us, Chris. Good evening, by the way.
Evening.
What's the core of the criticism here?
Well, there's been two strands of criticism in the last couple of days. First, as you were saying, this criticism from the Home Affairs Select Committee today in this report suggesting that this idea of reintroducing exit checks enabled to document who is leaving the country may not be able to happen on time. The government plans to reintroduce them by April of next year. The Select Committee suggesting that they have doubts. They share the doubts of some transport companies that this system is going to be ready in time. It used to happen years ago that there was comprehensive checks on passports and travel documents of people leaving the UK. They were phased out back in the 1990s in favour of what the government then decided was a more intelligence-led approach. But there's been a desire across the piece, really, politically, to see it reintroduced, but it has proven very tricky to do. The idea being that without them, you can't track the whereabouts of dangerous criminals or confirm if illegal immigrants have actually gone about leaving the country.
So where does this leave the government's targets?
In terms of overall targets, I mean, I think that if we step back from it a bit, what does all of this remind us of? It reminds us of that here passes another year in 2014 where immigration has been an absolutely massive item on the political agenda. And you can be absolutely certain in the coming months in the countdown to the general election, it will remain exactly there. What have been the big talking points about immigration? Well, there's that central target, as you were alluding to, that the government had aspired to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands, to less than 100,000. They're not going to meet that target, and they've pretty much acknowledged that. Then if you look at the micro, if you like, the smaller cases, the smaller scenario of how you manage the situation in Calais, I say smaller only in a geographical sense, it's a massive headache, this, for the government. Figures out yesterday suggesting that there are 100 attempts a day to get into the UK illegally this summer, many of them through the port of Calais, as you say, and into Dover. Now, some can make the case that that is proving that the system of trying to prevent these people getting in is working. There's others who make the case that the reason the numbers are going up is simply because more people are trying, or those who are there in Calais are making more attempts. And so what we've got is all of the political parties pretty much wanting to sound pretty robust on immigration. And then you've got the two strands. You've got the argument about European Union migration and the UKIP solution of leaving the EU and having a points-based system so only skilled people can come in to the UK, versus that bigger argument, as I say, which goes beyond the EU, which is the question of people primarily from war-torn countries, sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, who are obviously non-EU citizens who manage to get into the EU and get to Calais and then hope to get to Britain. So a hugely complicated, hugely controversial topic, which is multi-layered and will continue to be debated, I suspect, every single day between now and the general election, and of course, way beyond it.
And of course, then, Chris, if I don't know, if Cameron decided he wanted a bit of an easier life, if Mr. Cameron decided he didn't want to be Prime Minister anymore, Theresa May might fancy her chances. So how damaged is she by all of this?
Well, what's interesting about Theresa May and her stint as Home Secretary, as she has been Home Secretary for a mighty long time. During Labour's time in government, being Home Secretary was seen to be something of a poison chalice, somewhere where you would go to a big senior office of state, but where your political career might bite the dust shortly thereafter. Theresa May has very much bucked that trend, being in that job ever since the coalition came to power. And yes, there is plenty of talk that she has ambitions beyond the Home Office, and were David Cameron, as you say, to seek a quieter life, or if the electorate were to ensure that he sought a quieter life and he was no longer Prime Minister and Conservative leader after the election, we can be fairly certain I think Theresa May would be in the mix to become the next Conservative leader. But, you know, to what extent is this sort of stuff damaging for her? Well, that overall headline promise, that 100,000 figure, you know, and failing to meet it, is awkward for the government, not just for her, but for the government overall, because it was something David Cameron was very, very keen on. But as I say, I think compared with many a Home Secretary, I mean, yes, there's been the controversies. There always are. There always is for somebody in that role, but there hasn't been anything that has been politically devastating in the way that for some previous occupiers of her office, events have proven to be.
And finally, Chris, how do the political parties, how does Labour differ from the Tories in terms of how they would handle, how they would tackle immigration?
Well, in big picture terms, both are going to want to sound very robust. Let's look at the European Union side of things. So we've got the Conservatives promising that if they win the election, there will be a referendum on EU membership by 2017, and they say that they're going to renegotiate Britain's relationship with Brussels between now and then. And David Cameron's written a piece in the Daily Express today in which he has repeated some of his arguments about wanting to ensure that freedom of movement, people's movement within the European Union can remain, but that it isn't exploited by people who might want to access the benefit system here or skip their way up the housing ladder, that kind of thing. So that's the Conservative position as far as the relationship with the EU is concerned. They also say that they've thrown quite a bit of extra money at the situation in Calais to try and beef up the checks that go on there to try and prevent illegal immigration from Calais into the UK, and that is, as I say, primarily from people from outside of the European Union. As far as Labour are concerned, they've made the case that this net migration target, is pretty arbitrary and has been is arguably counterproductive, because you might be putting off very skilled people coming in from outside the European Union, because that's the one element of migration that you can control when you're in the EU, whereas you can't control those from within the EU moving. But Labour are also making the case, Ed Miliband has made this repeatedly, that the Labour government, as was prior to 2010, had made mistakes. They had grossly underestimated the number of people that will come to the UK from elsewhere in the EU, and the likes of Poland and other countries joined up. So they say, yes, we will be robust. Yes, we've learnt the lessons of the past, but they argue that you don't need to do that by being as vitriolic in your language as they suggest the Conservatives have been.
OK, Chris, thank you. Listening to that, Tony Smith, former head of the UK Border Force, now a border and security consultant. Hello, Tony. Hello there, Tony.
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening. I'm Paul Flynn, Labour MP for Newport West, sits on the Home Affairs Select Committee. Hello, Paul.
Good evening.
Good evening, good evening. Is the system failing, Paul?
Yes, it is, but it always has failed. I wouldn't be at all surprised if your listeners have lost the will to live after hearing that wholly accurate account of the mess that it's in at the moment.
Well, now, be fair to Chris Mason, our political correspondent, please, Paul. He's a friend of mine. Nobody would lose the will to live listening to Mr. Mason.
It's the situation that's the problem. I mean, what his report was absolutely accurate, but it describes a situation where politicians, some like UKIP, have fallen over themselves with scaremongering accompanied by the tabloids, and the other two main parties, including my own, I'm ashamed to say, have gone to the other extreme to try to find how punitive they can have against immigrants coming in. Now, there's a whole area of abuse here. I'm sorry about that. But I think the main issue that hasn't been addressed, even by a correspondent, is the ludicrous maldistribution of asylum seekers. Would you believe that there are twice as many asylum seekers in Cardiff as in the whole of the southeast of England outside of London? Cardiff's got 900. My constituency has got 400. The Theresa May's constituency has got 1, which is an increase in the number she had last year. The Prime Minister's constituency and the Chancellor's constituency have none at all. So what we've got is not a country that's full up. We have a country where the problems that are inevitable, I'm afraid, when new populations move in, the strains on the schools with people who don't speak English as a first language, on the hospitals and the other services, that's felt in only a small number of areas. And there's whole tracts.
So what would you do to fix it?
Where there are no asylum seekers.
What would you do to fix it?
We'd make sure there was an even distribution. I mean,
how do you do that?
You do that by encouraging the local authorities to take their responsibilities, to encourage the MPs in those areas to take their responsibility. I mean, a huge part of my
But with respect, Paul, that kind of means nothing, doesn't it? To encourage them to take the responsibilities.
Yeah,
who's going to deny they're not taking the responsibility now? So what actually would you do?
I'd make sure we had swift decisions on those that are coming in. There were 400,000, it's now 300,000, who are waiting for a decision. What happens? They come in, whether they've got a genuine case or they're economic migrants working the system. Sometimes they have to wait for years and years, by which time they've settled down here. They often marry, have children. It's very difficult to deport them. If we had swift justice, if we took a swift decision that these people are bogus, and many of them are, sadly, others are genuinely seeking refuge because their lives are at stake, they should be allowed to come in. Others have skills,
Tony?
like the many Portuguese that are coming in now.
What do you make of that, Tony?
Spanish that are coming in now. But it's a complete mess, and it's politicians are to blame, I'm afraid.
What do you make of that, Tony?
Well, I think, if we're going to talk about asylum, we need to look at the history of this. I was in the agency in its various forms for over 40 years, so I saw a lot of changes in that time and worked for a lot of different governments. But, I mean, if you look at the figures, asylum intake into the UK has hovered around about the 25,000 a year mark for about 10 years now. That's about seventh, I think, on the EU scale. And I can remember back in 2002 when we had 80,000 asylum seekers, and that really did put a huge pressure on the UK infrastructure. We had asylum seekers camping on our beaches, if you remember, and the department really struggled to recover from that because asylum cases are hugely difficult to conclude. And, we're constantly criticised for backlogs, but at that time there was very little we could do in the wake of those numbers other than to grant them temporary release. Many of them disappeared. Some of them may have left the country because we don't have exit checks. And so, we've been in recovery mode. But I think, I spend quite a lot of time at global border conferences these days. And the UK, when stacked up against these sort of complex issues in other countries, isn't quite as bad as some people are saying.
Part of this, Tony, is a much bigger problem, isn't it? To do with criminal gangs and lawlessness in the likes of Libya.
Well, there's been a threefold increase, the UNHCR told us last week, to about 180,000 illegal migrants entering the EU external frontier. And yes, you're right, that's mainly across the Mediterranean Sea. We were talking to some of the guys from the Finland border guard. They've been down in Libya trying to help them build a structure. But, I mean, there are armed gangs there. These guys are going to shoot you if you go and try and stop them, loading people into boats, and I'm afraid that this is anarchy in these countries. Some of the agencies are complicit with this. We've got tragedies happening every day on the Mediterranean Sea with people drowning. So it's a huge migration, a threefold increase in people entering the EU illegally. And then, of course, when they arrive in Italy, where most of them arrive, it's virtually impossible for the Italian authorities to cope with those numbers. They're simply registered and released. There are no borders in Europe under the Schengen arrangement, and so people will migrate north to the northern countries, which are generally perceived to be more prosperous, so Germany, the Netherlands and the UK. But, of course, when you get to the UK, well, we've got our border in Calais, and that's a really important nexus point for us because, as reports have shown in the past week, we have done a pretty good job there of stopping people getting into the UK. So things could be a lot worse than they are.
Paul?
Unfortunately, if we did a brilliant job at Calais, and what would happen is the immigration would take place further along the coast. Lots of other crossing points. They go to Calais now because they're told that this is the gateway to the El Dorado of the United Kingdom. But if we suddenly shut it all down altogether, and we could do that by arresting those criminals who live and make a very good living from various nationalities. They come and they organize their own nationals, and they come across, some very dangerously in lorries, some through corruption. There are rackets going on. There may be 2,500 people in Calais tonight. There were 2,500 a month ago, but they weren't the same 2,500. There's a constant flow across of people who pay often large sums of money to get across, either taking terrible risks themselves by hiding under lorries, or their positions are facilitated about corruption between the criminals out there and the people who are bribed in the transport system. Now that's going on.
Tony,
if we stopped it in Calais, it'd move further down the coast to the other crossing points.
Tony, what would you do to change the system?
Well, we can't go to Calais and arrest people because, of course, they're in France. I mean, what we need to do is work closely with the French authorities and the European authorities, which is something we are doing. I mean, I think the key really for the political agenda is the investment in the border force and what the plans are for investment in the border force, because it has been cut under the last government and under this one, the budget. We did have an injection of resources to help us through London 2012 Olympics, where I think we put on a pretty good show, actually. But I am worried that, if we're going to do proper exit checks, we do need officers there to do that. There was a UN Security Council resolution 2178 was passed just 3 months ago, which calls upon all governments to take steps to stop terrorists crossing borders, and this is an exit problem. I mean, we've got our own, British passport holders travelling over to Syria to fight against us. So we need people who are available at the border, police and border officers, to arrest, to identify those, to arrest them and to deal with them. And without exit checks, we can't do that. So, we do need to find some money from somewhere to be able to fund all this, and we do need to look again at our technology. We have had a couple of fairly catastrophic failures with the e-Borders program and the integrated caseworking program over the last few years, and so we do need to keep on top of the game and modernise our system. But as your reporter said, this is a hugely complicated business, and relatively speaking, I don't think we're doing as badly as some people are saying we are.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Tony, thank you. Paul, thank you. Let's get the news.